first border. If he could properly garrison the Elbe and the Danube, Rome would have a secure natural border from the North Sea to the Black Sea, and he could go to his grave knowing that he was leaving behind a stable empire that could last forever. Borders in the north, though, did not begin in Germania or Illyricum. It actually began much closer to home. Augustus decided that before he could think about pushing the borders of the empire northward, that he would need to plug the one glaring hole with Roman domination over Western Europe, the Alps. For all they had conquered in all their years of expansion, Rome had never actually nailed down the troublesome mountain tribes in their own backyard. Augustus aimed to put a stop to this embarrassment once and for all. To oversee the operation, he chose once again to elevate Tiberius, who might get a chance to actually fight a battle this time around. Joining Tiberius as a co-general would be his younger brother Drusus. Augustus wanted to make sure that whatever glory was won in the Alps and in his planned future campaigns along the Danube and in Germania, that it was all kept in the family. Augustus knew that the greatest and most likely threat to his rule would come from an independent general winning great battles for Rome all on his own. So Augustus was careful to always give overall command of a campaign he initiated to someone he could trust not to turn against him. In practice, this meant members of his own family. So even though his stepsons were in their early 20s, much younger than your average Roman general, they were still put in command. It was just a happy coincidence, really, that they turned out to be highly effective leaders. I'm going to leave it there for this week. Next time, we'll dig into the campaigns of Tiberius and Drusus as they attempt to implement the vision laid out by their stepfather of pushing the borders of the empire to the Danube and Elbe respectively. Next week, we'll also mark a transition period for Augustus personally, as the old friends who had advised him and guided him for his entire career begin to die off, leaving the princeps alone at the top, fervently trying to protect his legacy in the face of one cruel twist of fate after another. But before we go, I want to throw one other thing out there. I've been approached about having the show sponsored by Audible.com. The deal would involve me reading some ad copy and directing you, my faithful listeners, to visit their fine website in exchange for giving me some money. The history of Rome has always been ad-free, and I like it that way, but I'll admit I am intrigued by the idea. Podcasting is something I enjoy immensely, and any hypothetical plan to take this from something I do in my spare time to something I actually do to draw an income involves advertising of some kind or another. So basically, I want to know what you all think. Should I take the plunge, or will it turn you off? My first priority is maintaining the integrity of the show, so if it turns out to be too intrusive, I'll cut it off immediately, but I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com or drop me an email. We're all in this together, so I figure we'll make it a group decision. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 54, All in the Family. Before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for their feedback on the sponsorship issue. Based on the comments, it looks like ads will be a go. I'm not sure exactly when they're going to start, but I promise not to let it get in the way of anything, and the content itself won't change a bit. When we left off last week, Augustus had set his sights on clearing out the last pockets of resistance to Roman rule within the existing boundaries of the empire, before setting out to push those boundaries northwest to the Danube and Elbe rivers. Tiberius and his younger brother Drusus, both in their early 20s, had been put in charge of the initial phase, pacifying the independent tribes living in and around the Alps. As I mentioned at the end of last week, it was important that Augustus elevate his stepsons to prominence as quickly as possible. The princeps' health had always been a concern, and even though he wound up living well into his 70s, the specter of sudden death always loomed large in his mind. Agrippa had thus far served admirably as a backstop in case Augustus were to die, but, let's face it, he was growing old as quickly as Augustus was. A new generation would have to be ready to step forward if and when the princeps died. It is worth pointing out, though, that as much as selfishness contributed to Augustus's promotion of his stepsons because he wanted power to remain within the family, he also had his eye firmly on the public good. By having a well-established succession plan in place, Augustus could die knowing that when he did, it would not plunge his people back into immediate civil war. But just as Agrippa had been a necessary stand-in when true descendants of Augustus were unavailable, Tiberius and Drusus were now being set up to play much the same role. Though Augustus liked and trusted his stepsons, he was still biased towards passing power to a blood relative. It's almost as if the claim that he was not setting up a monarchy dominated by a royal family was completely bogus. The temporary status of Tiberius and Drusus as heirs apparent became clear once Agrippa and Julia's new family began to grow. After marrying his best friend to his only daughter in 21 BC, Augustus kept a close eye on the new couple, hoping they would produce a long-term solution to his dynastic problems. It did not take long for Augustus to be greeted with the happy news that Julia had given birth to a son, Gaius, in 20 BC. More good news followed, as the marriage of Agrippa and Julia proved to be a fertile one, and year after year they produced child after child. In 19 BC, Julia the Younger was born. In 17 BC, a second son, Lucius. 3 years later, Agrippina the Elder was born, followed in 12 BC by the final son, Agrippa Posthumus, so named because he was born after the unfortunate early death of his father, which we will get to in a moment. In addition to this week's maps, which highlights the Danube provinces secured during the period, I've also posted a family tree of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They're a tricky bunch to keep track of because not only did they share about 3 total names between the whole lot of them, so which Agrippina are we talking about again? There was also some pretty heavy intermarriage going on. So I hope the family tree will help you sort everyone out. Keep it handy because it should be good for about 80 more years. The curse of Gaius and Lucius immediately put a sell-by date on Tiberius and Drusus. In a highly irregular move, Augustus decided to adopt the boys when they were still infants, bring them into his household, and raise them himself. There was simply too much at stake not to involve himself in every aspect of their lives and education. One of them was destined to sit on the throne. Augustus needed to make sure that they would be ready. But just because there was a planned obsolescence now built into Tiberius and Drusus, that did not mean that Augustus could simply ignore them. It would be 20 years or more before Gaius and Lucius could even begin the process of establishing public lives for themselves. Tiberius and Drusus were ready now, and with all the illnesses that had felled him over the years, Augustus knew that lasting the 20 years before his grandsons would be ready to take over was a dicey prospect at best. Plus, the ancient world being what it was, there was no guarantee that Gaius and Lucius would even survive childhood. It was best to keep as many irons in the fire as possible. So on the off chance that either Tiberius or Drusus was indeed destined to succeed him to the throne, Augustus made sure that everything stayed in the tight family he was building. So in 19 BC, he had Tiberius marry Vipsania, the daughter of Marcus Agrippa by his first wife, and not long after, Drusus married Antonia, the daughter of Augustus's sister Octavia, and, ironically enough, Mark Antony. Both marriages were happy ones, though in the case of Tiberius, it was this very happiness that would open up a rift with Augustus that would be the hallmark of their future relationship with each other. In 17 BC, Augustus began to set the stage for his imperial expansion. That year, one of his generals in Gaul lost a minor battle to some Germanic tribes. Rather than letting the incident pass without notice, Augustus saw his opportunity to open up legal war in Germania. Just as is the case with most every civilized country across history, Rome never just declared war. Hostilities were only opened once Rome or one of their allied kingdoms was attacked. It was very important to the Roman sense of themselves that they only entered into just wars of self-defense. In theory, this meant that they were always on strong moral footing when they marched off to war, but in practice, this meant that they simply seized on the flimsiest pretext to launch a campaign. Now, Augustus had his flimsy pretext. He traveled himself to Gaul and began reorganizing the legions there to prepare them for what would no doubt be a difficult push across the Rhine River to the banks of the Elbe. The princeps would remain in the province for a good 3 years, keeping himself within easy reach of all the campaigns he had initiated. The first major push, as I said at the end of last week, was Tiberius and Drusus's invasion of what would become the province of Raetia, which covered modern-day Switzerland and part of Austria. In the single summer of 15 BC, the two brothers ruthlessly prosecuted a war of pacification against the tribes living there. The casus belli for the invasion, I should note, was some reported ill treatment of Roman citizens passing through the territory. Flimsy pretexts, I has them. Rather than being satisfied with simply beating the tribes on the battlefield and turning them into taxpayers, the two brothers decided that the best way to ensure the mountainous region remained safe for Roman travelers was to initiate a mass deportation of the men. Those who weren't sold into slavery were marched at spear point off their land. Women, children, and old men were left behind to keep the region nominally populated, but completely defenseless. Neighboring Raetia, incorporating the rest of modern Austria, was the recently consolidated, if still unofficial, province of Norica. The tribes there had been friends of Rome since at least 170 BC, and had actually been important allies of Julius Caesar during his civil wars against the Senate. In 16 BC, all Augustus had to do was order a proconsul in to occupy the land. The formal annexation of all the land south of the Danube was well underway. With Roman intentions obvious, the recently passive tribes inhabiting Pannonia rose up against encroachment. They had been beaten soundly by Augustus during his Illyrian campaigns 20 years earlier, but their territory had not been officially incorporated into the empire. The fiercely independent Pannonian tribes could barely stand unofficial servitude, so there was no way they were going to be able to stand official servitude. And with the legions on the march, that sure looked like what they were headed for. But that fierce independence would ironically sow the seeds for their loss of it, because not only were they predisposed to standing apart from Rome, they were also predisposed to standing apart from each other. Unable to establish a united front, the tribes were easily picked off one by one. That is not to say that the conquest of Pannonia took place overnight, as the conquest of Raetia basically had, but just to say that the outcome was never really in doubt. In 13 BC, the 29-year-old Tiberius served as consul for the first time, obviously long before he should have qualified for that office. Lifting age restrictions for his possible heirs was one of Augustus's favorite tricks to give them a leg up on the competition. When his year in the consulship was done, Tiberius would qualify for any number of proconsulships in the provinces, where he could continue to grow his power and prestige. All the while, his peers would be hoping against hope to nail down that first quaestorship. 13 BC also marked, finally, the passing of Marcus Lepidus. The old triumvirate had managed to last another 25 years living in comfortable obscurity after being booted from the triumvirate in 36 BC. The one concession Augustus had allowed Lepidus when the latter left the public stage was allowing him to remain as Pontifex Maximus, an office he had held since the death of Julius Caesar. When Lepidus died, Augustus naturally assumed the high priesthood. Now, the princeps was the official head of all three branches of Roman public life: the church, the state, and the military. At the end of the year, with operations in Pannonia going well but not perfectly, Augustus sent in Marcus Agrippa to bring the annexation to a speedy conclusion. Eager to get started, Agrippa immediately set sail for the Balkans and spent the winter there, planning the next summer's campaign. But it was a campaign that he would not live to see. Suffering from a number of nagging ailments, Agrippa caught sick and was forced to return home in March of 12 BC.